This is episode number 175 of the Guns Magazine podcast. Hi there, and welcome to the Guns Magazine podcast, one of the shooting world's biggest gun talk programs. I'm your host and the editor of Guns Magazine, Brent Wheat. Thanks for joining us as we talk to the interesting folks who make up the world of shooting, hunting, law enforcement, and the firearms industry. Before we get started, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor, 4 Patriots. Let's face it, if you don't have electricity, you're living in the Stone Age. But with the Patriot Power Sidekick from 4 Patriots, you get a solar generator that doesn't need installation. It's quick, easy, and portable, on the go, or even inside. The Patriot Power Sidekick is small, about the size of a lunchbox, but it's powerful. Powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, or even a mini fridge. The setup comes with a free solar panel, free shipping, a 365-day satisfaction guarantee, and best of all, you get 10% off your first purchase by typing in the code GUNMAG at checkout. That's 4patriots.com. Use the code GUNMAG. I'd also like to mention our supporting sponsor, iPal. Here's a simple product for all iron sight shooters. Simply attach the static clean iPal peep sight to your prescription or safety eyewear on your dominant eye, and you get a focused sight picture. Plain and simple, this aperture resolves difficult vision issues. Go to iPal USA to get your kit today. My guest today is a favorite, longtime gun writer Will Dabbs, MD. Will's day job is doctoring, but he's also a weapons expert and collects military firearms. In fact, he says it's an addiction rather than just a hobby. In our talk today, Will discusses why he does it, where he gets his guns, and some tips on starting your own military firearms collection. Now here's Will Dabbs, MD, on military gun collecting. Well, good morning, Will.
Good morning.
I appreciate you taking time out. We're doing this via Zoom. I've never really mentioned that, but we're doing that, and it cracks me up every time you come on. You're sitting in the cockpit of what is that, an F-15?
That's an F-18.
Okay. Twin tails, I wasn't really sure, but it looks like you're sitting in a cockpit. That's really pretty cool. So if anybody else, like most of us, has death by Zoom meetings, you need to get this background Will's got, because it looks like he's flying in formation. So that's pretty cool.
I live in a fantasy world. It's just a little piece of the overall puzzle.
Well, you do. And, I tell people I'm the happiest little boy in America, but truly that title belongs to you. I mean, it does.
We can share it.
Okay. Well, if you don't know, which would surprise me, but if you don't know, Will Dabbs is a well-known gun writer, and he writes for Guns Magazine, American Handgunner, and a whole bunch of other things. But Will's one of my favorite writers. The guy can turn a story, and the one time I was editing and used a metaphor of like beats through a toddler. That was just so descriptive. I've always remembered it. So
it cost me $15 a week to get Brent to say nice things like this about me. It's the best investment I've ever made.
No. You earn every bit and more, so we really appreciate it. But among your many avocations, you collect military weapons, and you were telling me the other day that you kind of pitched a story series, which we may be doing, but you've got all kinds of militaria and firearms. So give us the high-level explanation. What is it that you're building here?
Well, that's a great question, and to really understand that, you have to understand the nature of addiction. Mom and dad tell me I'm not adopted, but I was the first professional soldier in my family since a Confederate captain. And I just got the gene for it. And when the other normal little kids were out playing on tricycles and stuff, I was running around with bent sticks, acting like I was shooting people. And it's just that has gone back to the very beginning. And that's my weakness. And I bought my first Daisy BB gun when I was 7. My dad and I split the cost. It was $7. So I scraped up $3.50. And that was my gateway drug. And it's honestly fairly hopeless at this point.
Well, a lot of guys will, narrow it to certain types, World War II guns or, guns of the Allies, those kind of thing. Are you just anything and everything, or are you kind of specializing?
Well, I use my writing as an excuse, and just like addicts have lots of enabling excuses as well. But my collection is very broad and very shallow. So I have met folks who literally have 30 and 40 Luger pistols. Well, I have a World War I vintage Luger with a 4-inch barrel. I have a Navy Luger. I have an artillery Luger, and then I have a World War II vintage Luger, and that means my Luger collection is finished. And the excuse I use is I can always reach out and grab something that I need to write about, and that's what I tell the IRS, and they have fallen for it thus far. So I have a really sweet hustle. But the key to success, if anybody else wants to amass a decent military weapons collection in the 21st century, is you got to have 2 jobs. And I say so facetiously, but not really. I have a medical job that keeps the family fed, and then I get to work for Brent. And if I take all the money that Brent gives me and I put it on stuff I write about, I don't have to pay taxes on it, or at least not a lot. And that legit, that is my key to success is I don't sleep. And so I got started this morning at 4 o'clock. I went to bed last night at about 11, was on my word processor when I went to bed, and was on my word processor when I got up. And that's the nature of addiction. It's hard to understand from the outside.
Well, I've got to say, you are definitely, I think, the hardest working guy in journalism, because it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm pretty busy too, and I work from home. And it's not surprising if I email you early in the morning or late at night, you will fire right back. And even when you're doctoring, obviously you're checking emails between patients. So you keep yourself busy.
A little bit of me goes a long way. And my wife is very long suffering. She and I have been married for a long time. And
exactly.
If I didn't have this kind of avocation, as you alluded earlier, I would drive that poor woman crazy.
Yeah. Well, I've got to ask the big question right out of the gate. So what is the attraction? I mean, you've talked about your background, but what is it about these guns, these old, scarred up, battle worn, things that a lot of folks wouldn't even give a second look to when you see them at the gun store or at the gun show? What is that attraction that really draws you in?
You answered your own question. It's like a little history battery. And, when I grew up, I was born in 1966, so my world was liberally sprinkled with World War II veterans, and I'd had an addiction to military history since I was a kid. That's what I used to read constantly when I was young. And you can read about some of these extraordinary events, and you can speak to people who were there. But then if you have a military weapon that was actually used in combat, particularly if it's got the stigmata of battle on it, you can touch that, and it's a physical connection to some of the most extraordinary times. And as I said earlier, I live in a weird little fantasy world, and I get to dress up and act like I am something that I'm not. I did get to be a real soldier for a while, but that was a long, long time ago. But if I had to distill it down to its essence, and I've really not thought about this, I would say that it's a tangible connection to some truly remarkable times. And combat is the most extraordinary event in human experience. It rivals the birth of a child. We talk to people who've been there, and they will forever tell you that it's always been kind of downhill from there as far as the edgy nature of a human experience. And for normal folks like us, that's the way to touch it. Mm-hmm. And I have an SKS that has a piece of shrapnel through the magazine that I got from a Vietnam veteran, and you can pick that thing up. It was recovered in the drying, and it's a physical connection to something that was truly extraordinary. So that's my if I had to really encapsulate it into a couple of paragraphs, that's the appeal.
Yeah. And for folks that don't know, you're not a complete novice at this. You were actually a helicopter driver in the U.S. military before you went doctoring, which is really a strange career path. But just give us a high-level overview of your military service, just kind of as a background to show that you do understand of what you speak.
Sure. Well, I was a mechanical engineer, grew up in Mississippi, and always wanted to be a soldier. but I wanted to fly J model P-38s in 1944, and I was born a little late for that.
Yeah.
And I figured Army helicopters were the next best thing. So I spent 8 years on active duty as an Army helicopter pilot. I flew OH-58s, Alpha Charlies, UH-1, CH-47s, and S model Cobras. And I'd planned on doing that for 25 years and then teaching physics in high school. I had a physics teacher who was a World War II veteran naval officer who made a big impression on me, and that was the path I was going to follow. But the deployments ate me alive. I averaged about 8 months out of 12 away from home, and when I had kids, I realized I had a choice. I could either be an Army helicopter pilot or I could be a husband and father. And so, like an idiot, I got out and went to med school, but it has turned out well. I had expected when I was on active duty to find 450, 500,000 people just like me, folks who had grown up reading military books and lived for guns and so forth. And it turned out that most of the guys with whom I served were maybe a little more dedicated than your typical run of the mill guy, but it was just a job for most of them.
Yeah.
But I am deeply thankful for the time I spent in uniform, made some magnificent friends, and it kind of set the standard for friendships and experiences ever since. You know, if I go to a restaurant and they don't get the condiments right on my hamburger, it's not nearly as bad as that boiled rabbit I ate in survival school. It puts all my problems in perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Well, circling back to our topic, which is your militaria collection, right? Let's go to the top of the pyramid. It's like picking your favorite kid, but do you have a most prized gun in your collection?
You know, it's a great question. I've got weapons that are more expensive than this, but the most extraordinary piece that I own is, and I've written about it a time or two before, but it's a Japanese Type 99 paratrooper machine gun. And I've never had any great passion for Japanese weapons. You know, they have kind of a steampunk sort of appearance to them. They look fairly inefficient.
Yeah.
But this particular gun is actually unfired. I've stripped the whole thing down and looked at all the different pieces, parts. It's not that it's been cleaned. It's that it's never been fired. And I bought it from the son of the man who killed the previous owner.
Oh, wow.
And I know all the details about where it was captured. He was on the island of Leyte on December 7th, 1944, was an aircraft maintenance guy. And that was the last of 3 Japanese parachute assaults during World War II. And the Japanese had saved their paratroopers as a strategic reserve. And there at Christmas of 44, the last year of the war, they were going to expend them. There were 350 of them. We're going to try to take back some of these airfields in the Philippines. And right at dusk, this man just heard people yelling, paratroopers, paratroopers. He ran outside with an M1 and he saw this big guy coming down under canopy and shot and killed him. And he reported that the guy hit the ground like a sack of cement. He was dead or badly disabled when he hit the ground, but he was a really big man. This Japanese paratrooper was more than 6 feet tall.
Wow.
But the fight went on all night long. I've since researched it significantly and read a lot about it. They killed the Japanese paratroopers to a man, and the following morning they bulldozed a trench and buried all the corpses and gathered up all the weapons, burned off the ammo, and he brought this gun home. And is this the kind of story you want to hear? Because it's actually there's a little more to it. It's a cool story.
Oh, keep going. This is fascinating.
All right. Well, he brought it home and hung it on his wall. Obviously never fired it. And then in 1968, he had a neighbor who was suspected of being a bank robber. And so the FBI approached him about setting up a stakeout in his house. And so he said, sure, that's fine. And these 2 FBI guys set up in one of his bedrooms. And while they were there, he left the door to he had put the gun in a closet. He left the door to the closet standing open, and one of the FBI guys saw it and asked him if it was registered. And he said it wasn't. And he said, well, you got 12 days. And that happened to be in that 130-day period in 1968. That was the 130-day amnesty we've had for machine guns since 1934. And so the FBI guys got the paperwork for him and helped him register it. So it's amnesty registered in 68.
Wow.
And then when he died, he was not real close to his son. And it went about 15 years before anything was really done about it. And his son drove over a bridge every day going to work, and he told me that he's every single day he said, tomorrow I've got to remember to stick that gun in the back of the car so I can throw it off the bridge.
Oh, no.
And every day just forgot to do it. And eventually, through a mutual friend, I bumped into him. It took a dear friend who's a gun nerd lawyer to unscrew the paperwork.
Yeah.
And the transfer took better part of 2 years. But of all the guns that I own, once again, that's probably not the most valuable, but that's definitely the coolest story.
Absolutely.
I've got a cigarette that was in the guy's pocket who was carrying it. There was a lot of other paperwork and stuff that went with that the owner was not willing to get rid of, like the amnesty paperwork and such. And that disappointed me, but still, it was just there's a biblical reference to salvation, where if you find a treasure in a field and no one else knows about it, then you sell everything else you've got to buy that field so you can get that treasure. And that was sort of the same deal. When I bumped into this guy and I said, I offered to help sell it to somebody who could actually afford it. And he said, well, what could you give me for it? And I said, well, I'll liquidate everything I own and give it to you. What do you think? And I didn't have much in the way of resources at the time, but we struck a deal. And that's the gem of my collection. I've got some other cool guns and some other neat machine guns, but that one has the most compelling story.
Wow. Well, my next question was going to be, what's the most unusual? But that one, I think that just took the prize.
Yeah, that's the top of the heap.
Wow.
And there are a lot of Type 99s out there. I didn't really explain this, but this is actually a paratrooper Type 99.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure someone else has one, but I've never seen one before. It has a detachable buttstock. The pistol grip is steel and folds forward, and the barrel comes off. And it's like a Bren gun, feeds from the top.
Right.
7.7 Jap is the chambering, but the whole thing breaks down into a package that'll fit in a book bag. And there's a little flapper muzzle cover on the front that's broken off where the guy landed on it, but otherwise it's as it came out of the factory. And as I said, for whatever reason, this guy jumped into combat in Leyte, never having fired this particular gun. So there's no carbon on the
Wow.
Bolt piston or any of that. And all the numbers match with the exception of the magazine well cover. It's off by one digit. So when they were manufacturing the gun, they put the mag well cover was one digit off from everything else. It's just intriguing.
Yeah. And like you said, there were not a lot of Japanese paratroopers around. So that type of Type 99 is, pretty rare.
Yeah. All the paratrooper guns, the Type 100 submachine gun is another incredibly rare bird. And they all came from that one fight. There were 3 parachute assaults, 2 earlier in the war, but the only one that was such a rout where we got to actually capture the guns was that one fight on December 7th, 1944.
Wow.
So that's the appeal to me. Going back to what we talked about earlier, I can touch that, and it's a tangible connection to some most extraordinary drama.
Yeah. And did you say December 7th?
It was, which makes it easy to remember.
Yeah, interesting. So this is going to be a tough one, but it's a very personal question. What's the holy grail for you? What's the one gun you really would feel like it would complete your collection, or the long sought after, but it has escaped your grasp up to this point?
Well, like the Grail, it's the kind of thing that geeks like me think about, but will never actually touch. I would like a Type 1 FG42. And, the FG42, depending upon what you read, between 5,000 and 7,000 copies were made. It was really not all as awesome in practical use as we make it out to be. It's just that it's such an extraordinary piece of firearms history. But the first operational use of that FG42, if I remember correctly, was the Gran Sasso raid where the Scorzani's paratroopers snatched Mussolini. And there's some pictures of Type 1 FG42s with those ZF4 scopes mounted that were used in that raid, and not a shot was fired. None of them were actually unlimbered. But the Type 1 is a little more rare than the Type 2. And nowadays, I have not priced them lately. It's probably pushing $250,000 if you were to buy one at auction. And so those are numbers that I will never see. But if I could actually put my mitts on one, it would be the Type 1, which has the raked pistol grip, FG42 with an original scope.
Well, I mean, we're paying you well, but we can't go that far.
That's probably not going to happen.
So what is the oldest U.S. gun you've got? I assume some single action Army type things, or? U.S. gun. I have an original Brown Bess musket, and and that dates back to the 18th century. Yeah.
And that was one of the IMA guns that came out of Nepal. And so I bought it as just a piece of junk. The furniture was literally termite and worm eaten.
Oh my!
And it came with a spare stock, so it was a cool project to resurrect the metal and put that back together. So that's probably the oldest military weapon that I've got. I've got an original 1851 Colt Navy, got an 1849 revolver, and if we've got time and you're interested, I can run through where I go about finding these things. But that's probably the oldest martial weapon in my collection now.
Well, you wrote a story for us a couple of years ago about a pistol find that involved a backhoe, but go ahead and go down that road.
Yeah, that was a loaner from a friend who, and it was right down the road from where I live. You assume that all the interesting things in the world happen in Athens and Jerusalem and London, but here I sit in rural Mississippi, and there's some of the most extraordinary drama that took place right down the road from where I live here.
Yeah.
And that particular gun was a Remington 1858 that was a guy was digging a drainage ditch and with a track hoe and pulled up a giant ball of dirt and saw a piece of it sticking out and cleaned it up. He had it on the wall in his gun shop. And I eventually tracked down the date that it would have been. There was only one casualty that day, one Yankee officer who obviously dropped his weapon and it sank, and that was that. But once again, it's just an extraordinary connection to such a dramatic time. But that was right down the road, and I had to give that one back. But it was a really compelling story.
Yeah. So you live in Mississippi. Do you go to like gun shows or garage sales and find old muskets and cap and ball pistols, or where do you pick up a lot of this stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. The American Deep South used to be a war zone, and so the stigmata of combat, even 150, 160 years hence, is still here if you go looking for it. There's an antique store in town that's like an antique mall, and there's a guy who I don't know where his guns come from. I've never met him, but he just has a corner booth, and there's always about 15 or 20 antique weapons. I bought a 1864 Springfield out of that collection that had just come from somewhere around here. But they're basically there are three main sources for vintage weapons, at least in my world, and Gunbroker is at the top.
Yeah.
But the nature of Gunbroker is that's a good way to assess what market value for an antique weapon is, because it's got global reach. It certainly goes from coast to coast in America. It's like a 24/7 gun show. And so it's hard to find really good deals on Gunbroker. You can see what a gun is worth because that's what it'll go for at auction. But the days of finding just an amazing steal at Gunbroker are over. But the cool thing there is that you can literally find just about anything you might be interested in.
Yeah.
And that's a good way to price a gun. If you're wondering what something's worth, just find one on Gunbroker and watch it till it closes, and that tells you what the market is. There's a website called bidtobuyguns.com, and that's a clearinghouse for small local auctions. And if you go to bidtobuyguns.com, there are dozens of little. I bought a Spanish set-me from an auction house in Alabama about 3 weeks ago, and it connects you with these small auction houses, and these auction houses are liquidating estates. And I have found some good deals there. The best deals I've landed there have been for expensive guns. And so the cheap stuff is usually, if it's a $200 or $300 or $400 gun, they'll get $200 or $300 or $400 for it. but sometimes if it's a $2,000 gun, the price won't go past about 900 or 1,000. And the Setme is a good example. It had an original Heinsold scope on it, and the scope itself off Gunbroker would be $1,000 optic. But I bought the rifle for $700 just because no one else who was bidding on it really knew much about the optic. The rifle was cheap, but the optic was kind of thrown in for free. So that's pretty typical. If you are willing to hunt, then you can find some decent deals there. And I've uncovered some really interesting pieces. But the best stuff comes from friends.
Yeah.
And particularly in my world where I see a lot of patients, I always make a point to pay fair market value for any gun that some little old lady brings in. But in this weird little job that I've got, people know that I'm interested in it. And so I've had several cases where very, very sweet folks will come in with this old rifle that was owned by an uncle or a grandparent or something, and they just want somebody that they know will appreciate it. And I will definitely do that. But I've tripped over some really neat heirloom grade weapons that are not necessarily really valuable or expensive, except for the fact that they've got magnificent stories. And so those are my three sources. I do very much enjoy gun shows, but I haven't made the time to go to gun show. We don't have really big gun shows close to where I live, and so it involves some traveling. I need to go to Dallas or Tulsa and take in some of those shows again. I haven't done that in a while.
That was a tip that I learned doing a podcast episode. Dwight Van Brunt was talking about, he liquidates a lot of estates and things like that. And he was pointing out that provenance of a firearm is very important. And basically that means that you can tell the story behind the gun and where it came from and how you got it and all this. And he was pointing out that, I've got several guns that have appeared on the cover or been an inside story. And he's like, you need to keep copies of those with the gun, and a file folder tells where you got it, how you paid for it, anything you know about it, or even experiences you've had with the gun. And you keep that all in a file folder so that at some point, whether you or your descendants end up getting rid of the gun, it makes it more valuable. So do you have a big, is it all stored in your head, or you keep a big file cabinet full of this stuff?
No, it's a great question. And when you see on the news that this weird gimpy gun writer has been crushed to death when his house collapsed because he had 4 million pounds of gun magazines in the attic, that would be me. But I'd make a point to do that. And I don't document the details as much as I should, but I do keep, whenever I write about something that's still in the collection, I keep a copy of the magazine in the attic. And I have discussed that with my wife and kids. I didn't start saving for retirement till I was 40. As this is my fifth career. But part of the legacy I want to leave to my family is they'll call up Morphe or Rock Island auctions at some point and then make a bunch of little young gun nerds very, very happy. And I would like to see when the time comes that each of these weapons is packaged like that, so that it has a copy of the magazine and the details that go behind it, and just so that the story can continue. Yeah. We never really own these guns. We just curate them for a time. Yep. And the money that you pay to own it is like rent. And you just happen to have something that has such an extraordinary history that Type 99 will eventually go to some other geek like me or end up in a museum, and other people will appreciate it. But we just keep them for a time.
Well, I was going to say, as prolific as you are as a writer, being crushed to death is a distinct possibility. Your house may be leaning. Have you checked the walls for level recently?
Well, my goal is to go at the bottom of a smoking hole with the tail of an airplane between my shoulder blades in my late 80s. And I say that kind of facetiously, but honestly, I can think of no better way to go. If I get crushed to death by gun magazines, there are worse ways.
Yeah. Well, the time that you told me you took your plane up just to see the hurricane coming in, I thought, okay, that seems a little odd, but you obviously survived.
Got some great pictures. That was a fun day.
I bet. So this wonderful collection, which sounds like I would just love next time or anytime I get down near where you are, I would sure like to come out and see your collection. But will this ever be complete? Do you think you're ever going to go, enough is enough? I've got plenty. I got more than what I need. We're done here. Do you think that'll ever happen?
Brent, man, we've got this psychic connection, you and me. Oddly, we've had this conversation, my wife and I. It's like a gas; it expands to fill the space available. And I used to chase rabbits, and so I got kind of on a gangster kick, and so I wanted a series of gangster guns, and that you can actually amass a great collection of gangster guns off of Gunbroker for not a lot of money because there's not any real market for old Remington Model 11s and that kind of thing. So there's not a lot of collector value there. But I've chased all those rabbits. And so my World War II collection is in good shape. My gangster collection's in good shape. Those bunny rabbits have been chased. And so now I save up for a big gun about every year and a half. And right now, what I'm working towards is I want a transferable HK sear. Oh. And, that's a piece of metal that's about the size of my thumb and is worth about a nickel. But if it has the paperwork that goes with it and it was registered prior to 1968, it's worth quite a few nickels in 1986. And so I've been saving my nickels for a long time to get that. Afterwards, I don't know. At some point, I may think about. I desperately wanted a tank, and I found the most magnificent British Scorpion light tank, and the price was right, and I'd been saving up for it forever. And then I was out on a beautiful day with my wife, and it was the perfect moment. The birds were singing, and I said, "Sweetheart, can I buy a tank?" and put it in the yard by the house, and it was a hard no, man. There was no wiggling that.
There wasn't even that pause.
No, there was not any room to wiggle.
Wow.
So I'd still love to have a tank, but I think that the convincing the spouse of that is probably a bridge too far. So I don't know. After in another year, when I save up enough money to get my HK sear, maybe I'll give up at that point.
Well, I got to ask, do you have a cannon? Because that is my holy grail, and it's achievable. You can buy them, but I helped with a Civil War reenactment late last year in the fall, and I sponsored a couple of the cannons, and I jokingly said, well, I get to pull the lanyard when they go off, and the guy they were really cool. I was like, well, yeah, and I'm like, are you serious? I get to shoot a Civil War cannon? And I did. And they double charged it for me. Of course, they were shooting blanks. So it was just powder, but oh my, talk about a life-changing experience. So I called my wife and said, we live in a subdivision, but it would look really cool to have a cannon, a wheeled cannon in the front yard. So do you have one, Will?
I do. And it's not quite exactly what you described. But our kids were homeschooled. They're all grown and adults now. But as a homeschool project, we built a 1/3 scale Napoleon howitzer. And you can get into a Civil War era cannon for less than you might think. I likewise have been to a big machine gun shoot one time and saw a mountain howitzer fired, and that kind of lit the fire. But in this case, it's a 1/3 scale. So the bore is 1 inch, fires 1/4 pound lead cannonballs that we would make out of wheel weights, and the barrel is sand cast with out of, I guess, iron with a steel liner in it. And I bought the barrel for probably, I don't know, $250 way back in the day, $300. Wow. And then the kids and I went to the Vicksburg Military Park because we lived about an hour from there back when we were doing this, and took pictures and made drawings and dimensioned the carriages that they had at the Vicksburg Military Park, and then came home and scaled them down to match this barrel. And so the thing still is about waist high, and shooting it will put hair on your palms, man. It will light up the countryside. And we have shot grape shot using Dixie cups filled with BBs. We've shot old batteries out of it. Anything you can shove into the gullet, you can fire. And I've got a piece of a tree trunk. I took a piece of steel rod and cut it into slugs. And I've got a tree trunk that's got a steel rod stuck in it that we shot with the cannon. But I got some wheels from Harbor Freight. Mm-hmm. They were store-bought. We made the rest of the carriage from scratch. But if you wanted a full-size one, the way to do it is build it in your workshop. And there are companies that you can find online that will sell you the tube for, it's not cheap, but it's not machine gun expensive either.
Right.
But that has been on my list to scale that up to a proper full size Napoleon howitzer. I just haven't gotten to that yet, but it's doable. And our little 1/3 scale Napoleon is a crowd pleaser. It's pretty sweet.
Well, unfortunately, now you've given me another project to take on, because that just sounds really cool. And that's reasonable in our area, because honestly, storage is the big problem I have. Sure. Is, we're not going to leave the wife's car outside in the weather just so I can store my cannon. But
what's wrong with you, man? That's a made-up priority.
I know. Keeping domestic tranquility is pretty important when you do what we do. So,
well, this thing's about the size of a lawnmower. So that's about as much space as it takes up.
Well, I've got a storage unit, so we're good to go. Well, in the time we've got left, any quick suggestions for folks that likewise think about collecting military firearms?
Well, it's interesting because you always think the golden era is behind you. In the 1950s, when these guys came home from the war and they all had pilfered trinkets, and then they had to pay for diapers and rent, they sold those Lugers in the 1911s for about nothing. And that is true. And I was thinking before we had this discussion, what was my first military weapon I bought? It was probably a KR-98 I bought back in 1985 for about $120, which seems great. But then I punched it in what is $120 in 1985, and it's about $450 now. And so you can still find a Mosin Nagant out there on Gunbroker for $400 or $500. But at the end of the day, it's all about money. And I didn't have any for decades. It's just that eventually I was blessed to have these two jobs that I got to support this side hustle. And the fact that you grant me the privilege of writing for you is the only reason I get to have this conversation and get to keep Gunbroker on my favorites on my laptop. But if I were a teenager now, like I was back in the 1980s, I would save up my pennies and get me some beater bolt action rifle. And then but this really is one of the best times in American history to be into guns. You can get into an AR-15 now for $500.
Yeah.
My first AR I bought when I was in 10th grade, which would have been 82, and I paid $486 for it. And adjusted for inflation, that's literally like $1,500 now. So it's actually a better time to be amassing a gun collection, particularly modern weapons now, than has ever been the case in the past, just because the market is fairly glutted. So this really is, these are the golden years of gun buying, particularly if you're into modern weapons.
We've said that many, many times in all of our publications. Well, Will Dabbs, medical doctor and I would call you a superstar. I know that you don't want to hear that kind of stuff, but you are. You're a superstar in the gun writing business and an expert, and we really enjoy having you at Guns, and folks need to pick up the magazine and check out your byline. We try to have you in there all the time. So I appreciate you talking to us, and I appreciate all your efforts for Guns Magazine, and when you get that cannon, give me a call.
Oh, Brent, you are my editor. You are my friend. You just spread all kinds of vicious lies about me and my capabilities, but I'm grateful for that. And I pinch myself when I realize that I get to do this and claim that it's work. I'm the most blessed man in the universe.
Will's one of my favorite people to talk to, and he's definitely one of my favorite writers. If you like this episode, you can go back to episode number 4, the first time I had Will on the podcast. And it also gives you a pretty good idea how the podcast has evolved and I hope gotten better. You might also want to check out episode 35, the one I mentioned in this episode, which features firearms appraiser Dwight Van Brunt. If there's a topic you want to hear, somebody you want us to interview, or you want to share your thoughts, please drop me a line. That's editor@gunsmagazine.com. As always, you can subscribe to us on your favorite podcast directory, such as Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Audible, and several others. And you can always get the latest episode on YouTube and at gunsmagazine.com. At the same time, please subscribe to the Gun Cranks audio podcast on those same directories, or you can watch it at the Gun Cranks YouTube channel. I'd also ask you to visit our great sister publications, American Handgunner Magazine at AmericanHandgunner.com, AmericanCop.com, and take a look at our numerous special editions available for sale on our websites and at Amazon. And finally, I'd like to remind you to visit our sponsor, 4 Patriots. You can find out more about their food kits and other preparedness supplies at 4patriots.com. That's the number 4, the word Patriots, and .com. And please don't forget our supporting sponsor, iPal. Visit them at ipalusa.com. Well, that's it for this episode of the Guns Magazine podcast. For the entire staff at FMG Publications, I'm Guns Magazine editor Brent Wheat. Now get out there and get shooting.